Um, sorry, this is slightly disconcerting because the presentation I normally expect on my laptop, but it's not there. So every time I look there, it's kind of, oh God, the laptop's gone. It's great to come here, and it's great to be in this room, actually. As soon as I walked in, I had a great sense of achievement, actually, because the last time I was in this room with Steve, we hadn't even secured the funding for the Future of Cities. So I'm really pleased that we've now got it. What I'm going to be talking about today is just an introduction to what we've done in ECI and what I'm currently doing in Sysenko, because that's an important background to the work, because my work really is participant observation, and I'll explain that as I go through. I'll explain what my research method approach is in the work, and the context for that work, what the background is, why am I doing this, what's given the driver to do this work. And then what I'm doing is really case studies, and my case studies are markets, and these are the markets that I'm looking at. And then my conclusions are both theoretical conclusions, what theoretical constructs are relevant and could be applied here, but also what policy relevance does this have? What are the policy conclusions out of this work? So the context for the research first. A bit of background about how we came to this point. ECI, Brenda and myself, Brenda was the first person, and I think I was the second person into ECI, into the energy team, back in the early 90s. And ECI has looked around the issue of market transformation a lot over that time, transforming markets to take into account energy use and carbon emissions. And the latest piece of work on that was transforming the market for buildings, building market transformation, which there's downloads from the ECI website. What I'm doing now is, as part of the Future of Cities programme, working just 1 day a week within ECI, and that's why my work with Sysenko is important, because I'm in Sysenko 4 days a week. And that 1 day a week, I started in January, and I've got another just over a year to run, so I'm 40% into this piece of work. So it's an ongoing piece of work. The conclusions need further development, and the theoretical analysis needs further work. So very happy for input on that. And a little bit about Sysenko, which is my 4 days a week. What I mean by participant observation is that I'm collecting my evidence through interacting with the marketplace 4 days a week. So if you like, I'm evidence collecting 4 days a week, but actually with my Sysenko hat on. And then I'm analysing that evidence 1 day a week with my Future of Cities and ECI hat on. What do we do in Sysenko? Sysenko is short for the Sustainable Energy Company. If you Google it, even if you spell it wrongly, you'll still find it, because we brought up all the web space around it, which is good. We do two things. We do consultancy. We're developing a portfolio of our own renewables. We've done consultancy at some of the larger landed estates and new build, particularly in schools, under the Building Schools for the Future programme. We're involved quite a lot now in new build projects. We're looking at some data centres. So that's the sort of work we do around consultancy. Development is very different. What happens here in the consultancy market is that the risk of the project lies with whoever the developer is, and we get paid on a consultancy basis to help them carry those risks. With development, we take on the risk. We're developing that portfolio at our own risk. We've got a portfolio of PV and wind, particularly, that we're developing, one or two other technologies as well, but those are the two major technologies. And that portfolio is, if we were to develop it all, it would be about £150 million at the moment. I don't imagine that we will develop it all, because there'll be issues like planning in particular projects that get in the way. So maybe we'll deliver half of that. So that's the sort of work we're looking at the moment. But that's where I'm sitting, if you like. When I'm in front of a customer, I'm got my Sysenko hat on, but at the same time, I'm understanding with my Future of Cities and ECI hat, what are the issues here in terms of the development of new markets and new business models, talking with suppliers, talking with customers, looking at opportunities, and then I take that evidence back and 1 day a week think about it, and that's what I'm meaning by participating in the market but observing it. And in a sense, this is the background to participant observation as a research method, to get an intimate familiarity with those people in their own context, not in an interview context, in their own context, to understand the realities that they face day to day and over a period of time, because they change. And that's how I'm gathering the evidence. How am I structuring the evidence? I'm structuring it in the form of a series of case studies. And case study is a research, Yin, or back in 1984, did what was a very useful work on case study methodology, and one that I used in my PhD thesis. So my PhD was by case study, so something that I've done before and find very useful as a way of understanding particular contexts. The evidence can be various. It can be through interview, it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, and what you're doing is building up a picture of a particular area from a rounder perspective, but understanding the context that unit is in. And the unit of the case study that I'm looking at is particular markets, because markets are an opportunity for change. A market, and it may be a new marketplace, it may be an established marketplace, but it's that market that gets changed by government policy, and where there's an opportunity for a new business model to meet a new need or a changed need. So that's the research approach. And in terms of understanding the evidence when I collate it, or as I collate it, there are two real drivers in how I analyse that. Grounded theory is again something that goes back to that I've worked with since my PhD. The grounded theory based approach, rather than having a construct and taking the construct out into the marketplace and trying to find the evidence that fits that construct. I'm going out with a more open mind than that, and finding theoretical constructs that fit the evidence that I find. I find that a much more satisfactory way around to do research. And it came from things that happened in my PhD. I found that a grounded theory-based approach much more helpful to explain what was actually going on in the marketplace. And in terms of perspectives that inform that, there are several: innovation theory, actor network theory, because it is really I am an actor in a network of a multiple actors, and organisational change, because there are existing organisations who may change and spawn new organisations, or have new things going on in existing organisations to deliver change. So those are the three areas of change of theory that I'm looking to draw on. The starting point from all of this, though, is well, what's changed? Why now? Why is there a sudden interest in changed business models? And I would argue that if you like, one of the things that the last Labour government really needs to be credited with is changing the nature of policy making in environment. Up till that point, it was really relatively evolutionary. Things were the same but slightly better. So, for example, the energy label, which is something that Brenda and I first worked on in about 1994 for fridges. This is now for buildings. But once you've ranked the whole marketplace, at the start there are generally no A's or A pluses. Most of the things on the marketplace, whether it's fridges or washing machines or cars or houses, fall into the lower end. And there are things that you can do to move the market, once you've categorised the market, to move the market over a period of time. But that's a relatively evolutionary approach. And what happened in really over the last few years, and I know some people, Steve included, would say that the Climate Change Act is legislating the impossible, the idea of an 80% reduction by 2050. But it set a goal with a series of intermediate measures and intermediate steps with 5-year budgets, and each of the 5-year budgets is by themselves not necessarily impossible. And it set a process of policy being goal-oriented. So building regulations, for example, aimed at zero carbon new build. Now, again, zero carbon new build is probably like 80% reduction in 2050. It's probably great as an aspiration, but horrific as a target. But the process of policy making was changing to become outcome oriented rather than, and I would argue revolutionary, rather than evolutionary. People didn't know how you would get zero carbon homes. And until a few years ago, that would always been a reason for not having them. Now, we set zero carbon homes as a policy objective, and we work out how we get there. And that's a transformation in the way that policy is being made. And what supports that is a series of detailed measures like market transformation, the label, minimum efficiency standards, incentives to get up to the top level, to bring that transformation about. So that's what's causing I think a shift. We did a piece of work between 2004 and 2008 looking at how you would get to a very low carbon building stock. This was part of the building market transformation programme. And this was one scenario that we did. Actually, it's one scenario that we did for the Royal Commission about how energy use might change in homes over a period of time, starting in 2000 with this is normally it's not good to put kilowatt hours of gas and kilowatt hours of electricity on the same axis, but this is to illustrate not kilowatt hours, it's to illustrate change, so forgive me. This is gas use, this is electricity use, and this is other fuel use. And what we were looking at was a scenario that the particular numbers really don't matter. It is not a prediction, it's an illustration, and the numbers could be anywhere around there. The point is that over a period of time, we are expecting that gas use that's used in heat-only devices would fall. Gas use in combined heat and power might begin to take over, so you're using that gas more efficiently. And the electricity that's provided to dwellings might not just come from the grid, it might come from a whole host of other sources. Now really, the detailed numbers behind that could be anything. I don't care what they are. I'm not interested in the numbers. I'm illustrated in the picture of change. If that or anything like that future came about, then the current organisation that we have for getting electricity from a power station to your home would fundamentally alter, because you're not talking about demanding power from the grid anymore. You're talking about demanding it from devices that may be local to your community or on your house. If this picture of gas use changed, the way that we sell gas would fundamentally change as well. So at some point, and I'm not predicting when or how, at some point between there and 2050, there will be a restructuring of the industry. That's a bifurcation in the marketplace, and that's what I'm interested in, because that is an opportunity for a new business model. And that's the focus of my interest, my passion, if you like, in the business, but the research as well. And if you like, what that is, if you take a Darwinian approach to technical change using a theoretical model, that's a change in the survival conditions of species, the species in this case being the company. A fundamental change in the survival conditions, so that species which did not flourish before now have an advantage they no longer had, that they didn't have before, and species which did have an advantage, like British gas, big flourishing species, don't necessarily have the advantage that they enjoyed previously, and like the dinosaurs, they may die out. So it was the nature of that change in the survival conditions that I'm particularly interested in. And also the thought that to get from here to here, it's actually not a technical problem. We know about PV or solar thermal or micro CHP. It's not a technical issue. It is an issue about how we understand markets and how we get very high uptake of technologies we already know about. A lot of people classifying this issue as a technical problem. I don't think it is. I think it's a changing the rules of the markets problem, and it's a how does business respond problem. So that's the background to the thought process. And what I think we're seeing now is, in response to these sets of drivers, renewable energy, renewable obligation certificates, feed-in tariffs, renewable heat incentive, carbon reduction commitments, emissions trading, climate change levy, and so on, we are seeing society organising itself differently. And if you like, if you have government as one corner of society, civil society, local organisations as another corner, and the private sector as potentially a third corner, you could argue about the structure of that. But what we're seeing is new kinds of relationships. So industrial and provident societies, community interest companies and cooperatives actually putting civil society into new forms of organisation to deliver projects. And we're seeing agents, so banks or private sector investors, particular individuals in communities or particular individuals in local government, being the cause of change within those organisations. So we're seeing new organisational structures, I think, in response to that, in response to those that societal level set of drivers. So now I want to go through a series of case studies that illustrate the kinds of changes that I'm looking at. And these are the case studies I'm looking at: information, the commercial marketplace for commercial property, what might flow from this thing called the New Green Deal, which nobody seems to know much about, but government wants to put in legislation in a few weeks' time. How the public sector is taking on this agenda and reacting to it, what's happening in particular communities, and also genuinely new business startups. So those are the sorts of case studies that I'm looking at as microcosms of this general phenomenon. Information as enabler. At the moment, the energy market is incredibly poor in terms of information. The energy companies only have an obligation to take your meter readings and tell you what you've used at least once every 2 years. And that situation is changing and will need to change, because that information becomes valuable for managing either your home, you choosing to manage your home differently, you managing an asset differently on your home which might generate power, and even in managing the whole network differently. That might, and that whole process of meters being able to communicate is that smart meter concept is described generally as smart metering. Interestingly, that in the very large, say very large, 100 kilowatts, so reasonably large market upwards, automatic meter reading is the norm, and so the energy companies know what's going on in any half-hour period in larger loads. Smaller loads than that, they just haven't a clue. And this is something that's really driven by legislation at the European level, and the UK is rolling out a program to install smart meters, 47 million meters in 26 million households. So that's a new market. It's a market which will emerge gradually over that period to 2020. And you might think, well, that's kind of sewn up, that meter companies are going to have that market. It's just a new meter. And the energy companies are going to have that market because they're the one that know that marketplace. But actually, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think there are other companies out there who know about managing information flows and communication flows, whether they're broadband companies or mobile phone companies, who are looking at that market and thinking, that's a huge opportunity for us to change. So change our business and change from being the mobile phone market really is becoming a utility market. It's really becoming something where price is everything, and margins are squashed, and a lot of those providers are looking to innovate. They've made their money as being innovative companies. They happen to be in mobile phone communications, and now they're saying we want to be an innovative company, not a utility company. So what can we do in this new marketplace to create a new market opportunity and have as our unique USP, if you like, that they understand information flows, and actually it's information flows, not meters, that's the issue here. So that's a very new market, and I have to say that's a market which at the moment is so new that I'm just watching how it develops, but it could be a case study written over 10 years, this one, to 2020. So in terms of outcomes and conclusions from that market, that there are few yet. I have to say the rollout plan's still out to consultation. The second case study that I'm interested in is the commercial leasehold relationship, and this is interesting because in the commercial world, in large buildings, something like 2/3 of the building stock is not owned by the person that occupies it. It's leased. And that leasehold relationship really goes back, that relationship between landlord and tenant goes back hundreds of years. And the regulatory framework surrounding it is very, very light touch, because government takes the view that a leasehold relationship between two commercial organisations is one that is entered into willingly, and because they're commercial organisations, in the full knowledge of the consequences. So government is very unwilling to intervene in this very ancient marketplace, if you like, between landlord and tenant. And that is a marketplace, if you like, almost waiting to fracture because of the regulation and the drivers that are coming about because of low carbon. And the spaces I'm talking about are typically offices, retail and warehousing. And doing something about a commercial property obviously requires action by the landlord in some instances, and action by the tenant in others. And depending on the precise terms of the lease, it can actually be very unclear about who is required to act in particular circumstances and what a tenant is able to do in certain circumstances, and what the landlord would regard as an alteration too far that they would want to correct at the end of the tenancy. So, for example, putting in insulation or replacing the windows might be regarded as something that actually is a material alteration to the fabric, and the landlord might not be particularly happy about that, and might want to replace them at the end of the tenancy, and the tenant is therefore in a very difficult position about whether they can alter certain elements of fabric. So it's a very challenging relationship. One of the interesting things that's happening is that there's potentially a third party to that relationship, which is either a facilities manager or an energy services company who could come in and do things off the balance sheet of either the landlord or of the tenant, if the contract structure can be got in place. The opportunities are around fabric improvement, the actual shell itself, around kit that's installed within the shell, electricity consuming kit, and particularly ICT, because energy consumption in ICT is just the fastest growing source of emissions. And then energy supply technologies that could deliver lower carbon forms of energy. The issues that I've come across to date in this marketplace are things like it's very much easier to finance energy supply measures than it is energy efficiency measures. And the reason for that is that quite often the energy supply is confined to a particular portion of the building around which a third party can take a lease. But they can't take a lease around the whole building because the tenant's already got that lease. And you need that lease for the bank lender or the finance provider to be sure that if it all falls apart, they can get their kit back. So refurbishing the lighting system, for example, or the cooling system in a building like this on a third-party basis would be enormously difficult, because how does the bank get the lights back if it all goes wrong? If you've got an energy centre where they've got a physical means of access to that energy centre and there's the plant room, and if it all goes wrong they can get the plant out, that's fine. So it's very difficult to finance this kind of kit replacement. Again, does the tenant do it or does the landlord do it? It's a very difficult problem, but cracking that problem is something that we've got to do in order to get anywhere near the kind of targets that have been talked about. There are offerings in this marketplace from a number of organisations listed there. It is a growing market, but it's a very early stage market. I think there's a lot to go in terms of this marketplace as a commercial opportunity, financing things off balance sheet. A couple of other supply technologies now, and I probably ought to move on a little bit more quickly. The PV market is a really exciting one. Could grow 5 to 30 times over the next few years, and there are particular opportunities in the built space, on roof space. But again, who owns the roof? We've had situations where we've been trying to work with our own lawyers who have a full repairing lease over the whole of their structure. On the other hand, we would want a 25-year lease to put the panels on, and the lawyers only have a 20-year lease, so they can't give us a 25-year lease. So they would or sublease for the roof. So they would have to lease back the roof space, take it out of their commercial lease, give it back to the landlord, so that the landlord could have a lease with us. But then the landlord doesn't necessarily want to do that because they inherit all sorts of other liabilities in taking the roof structure back, in terms of making it watertight and what happens if we penetrate it and damage the roof structure and so on. So it is not straightforward in terms of getting that kind of lease in place. And Hammerson's have found this. They wanted to actually tender out the whole of their shopping centre portfolio. Then realised that they'd given away all of their roofs in their lease structures, and they didn't have the right to put PV on those roofs because the tenants had full repairing leases. And then, in the end, found one shopping centre where, by accident, they happened to retain the responsibility for the roof space. They could use that as a case study, and they could then work with their tenants to persuade them that they've done it on their roof space. It would be a great idea. Look how much publicity it's got. Look how much carbon it's saved, what the income benefits are, and so on. Wouldn't it be a good idea if everybody else in the portfolio did it? But you know, it is not straightforward. The other area is large ground-mounted systems, which tend not to be in city centres, except possibly in car parks. And car parks are a great space for PV, car park roofs. So we're looking at installations of between 5 and 35 acres, and we have probably nearly 200 acres of PV that we're looking at developing at the moment.
Michael, I'm sorry. What is PV?
Sorry, photovoltaics. Generate electricity from sunlight. Wind is another technology that in this commercial marketplace could find an opportunity that thus far it hasn't. You think of wind farms as being things on hillsides, but actually sites next to industrial landscapes. The Green Park in Reading, right next to the M4. We've got a site up near the M6 that we're developing with 3 2-megawatt turbines. We've got several food factories and a number of distribution centres that we're looking at the moment. But it's a great opportunity, and actually, again, for time, I won't go into this, but we're looking at, for one distribution company that has 70 sites in the UK, whether they should do wind or PV. And actually, very strongly and very clearly, the answer is wind, not PV. They only own half their properties, so we've looked at the half that they own and the half of those that are in the south, and then the half of that roof space that's available to put PV on it, and then the impact on their operations of actually doing the installation, and then that's only 2.5% of their carbon, even after all that hassle. If we can find 5 of those 70 sites, we could put a 1.5 megawatt turbine up. We can generate 10%. We can generate electricity, which is equivalent to 10% of their carbon emissions, and we can do it all off balance sheet. It might not even be on their land. It could be on their neighbour's land. So, and which in terms of leases and so on is just a whole bunch easier. And I've put this image up because those turbines don't exist yet. This is a photo montage of our first site, which I know it doesn't look like an industrial landscape, but it is a field next to an industrial site. And the 2 turbines, that's 3 megawatts between them, £4 million worth of investment, selling electricity straight into the factory. And I'm going to be so excited when they go up. I think I'm going to be unbearable for a month. Right, the third case study, and I do need to move on, is the Green Deal market. The government's been talking about the Green Deal as, and the only detail that's available really is that energy efficiency both for owners and for tenants is very important, both residential and commercial buildings, and the aim is to find a way of paying for the savings, paying for the install from the savings that are made, and we are to expect legislation in the next session. There's been no consultation process. There's been no detail about the levels of money available, and I suspect they're not going to be enough, because I think they're talking about, or at least the Conservatives prior to the election were talking about something like £6,000 a dwelling, and from the work that we've done we think it's going to take more like £20,000 a dwelling to do a decent job. And that's the difficulty. They couldn't fund that at the moment, so what's going to happen is that this market of refurbishing homes is going to have to be one that we do the simple measures now, and then we go around and do another iteration later on, and so on. It's a very valuable market over the next few years if we are to refurbish to the levels that we think are needed. And obviously there are people wanting to play in that market, and the potential participants are obviously the energy companies, but I just don't think the energy companies have got the wit to deliver this, to be honest. They're too tied to, sorry I can't spell existing, I've just noticed, too tied to existing revenue models. They don't have the capacity to innovate. Nobody would sign off innovation. They're very, very conservative organisations. Retailers are a possibility. Data companies I've already mentioned as participants in the metering market, and from metering into this is an obvious step. And infrastructure and delivery companies, and put down Carillion, but you could add people like mighty facilities management, large facilities management players, you could add down there. None of those companies individually could do this, because this is a very complicated offer to actually put together. In terms of what is it that people are buying, and how is it financed, and how might it actually be delivered, because there isn't anybody that delivers whole house refurbishment at the moment. There are people that do cavity wall insulation, there are people that do loft insulation, people that do boilers. You might actually have a whole bunch of service providers to bring together to deliver this service. Right, fourth case study is really the public sector, because the public sector makes decisions in a completely different way to the private sector or to households. The particular area that I'm working in with Sysenco is building schools for the future, and there are 2 models for procurement here in BSF. This is old style BSF. What Michael Gove comes out with in January or February or March, when BSF gets launched, we understand, relaunched, we understand. Probably won't be called BSF, because that would be too politically difficult. But whatever comes out, whatever Gove comes out with, new look BSF will be different. But BSF to date, there have been 2 models of procurement. One, which is a design and build contract, where a private company builds it, hands it over to the local authority then takes it over and runs it. and one where contractors have a 25-year contract to design, build, finance, operate and maintain a school. And this latter route has a really demanding carbon target in it. I mean, really demanding, really quite challenging. And most of the providers aren't hitting it. And that's a whole other story in itself, not to go into now, but it is a really challenging issue. But the design and build schools have no other target other than building regs. And it's just insane in my mind to have a really challenging target here and bugger all target there, excuse my French, and be spending a lot of money to deliver a very challenging target and not be spending anything at all over here. It would be much better to have a more equal playing field, more equal set of targets that are higher than current targets, but perhaps less of a stretch than the current targets that the schools have. Some of the solutions that are being installed very, very badly, and therefore going wrong, and it's quite evident that the industry that's building schools does not understand a lot of the technologies, and there are major construction companies or major consulting companies that are doing this and making these mistakes. So biomass is completely oversized and runs a couple of hours a day and then jams up, and people why it goes wrong. But biomass needs to be sized very, very differently to conventional technologies. So there's a problem there, and some of the technologies that people are installing, pure plant oil based combined heat and power. So it's combined heat and power running off pressed rapeseed oil, and that generates all sorts of problems, and you really do wonder about the sustainability of that solution. It's an interesting case study as to why they arrived at the decisions they did, and where they go next. An illustration of this is work we've done at one of the schools, South Shields, where unfortunately, I think for lack of time, I'm not going to go into this, but this is a life cycle cost graph with a number of solutions that we've looked at on a life cycle cost basis. And anything below zero is a negative cost. So the kit has a certain cost to install, and then a certain cost over time to run it, whether it's fuel or maintenance or income from generation of power or whatever. And then over time, you look at what the net present value of that investment is, and a lot of those investments have a very, very negative net present value and are more expensive than conventional solutions. And actually, some solutions are better than conventional solutions. And what's important here is the changed frame of reference, if you like, which is moving from a first cost basis for decision making to a life cycle cost over 25 years basis for decision making. And actually, to be fair to the PFI process, it is delivering, at least people are looking at life cycle costing, and life cycle costing in carbon terms has to be the right way forward. Right, new models of organisation. This is the fifth case study, one more after this, communities. And we have two representatives of Low Carbon West Oxford in the room, and I'm a shareholder in Low Carbon West Oxford, and if you're not, you should be. They can explain it better than I, but West Oxford Community Renewables, there's two parts to it. There's the community group, if you like, and the renewables group, which is structured as an industrial and providence society to invest in and run a portfolio of renewables, and the benefits, the income from that goes back into investing in energy efficiency projects in the community. It's a leader, but there are lots of others following. All over the place, North Oxford and Kirtlington, and all over the area, and in fact all over the country. Another model for development of community renewables, if you like, is Energy for All, which develops the West Mill wind farm, which is a 6.5 megawatt wind farm over towards Swindon, and Energy for All have developed a whole series of wind farms across the UK, owned on a cooperative model or seeking investment from the communities that they are in, which is a great model, I think, for developing wind going forward. The final case study that I'm looking at is brand new business models, and David referred earlier on to my involvement in 2 Degrees. I was involved in 2 Degrees in the very early stages of getting it up and running. What it does, for those people who haven't seen it, they now hate the term. It's a social network. It uses social networking technology, if you like, to build a network of practitioners who are out in business, needing to find solutions and deliver them in their business to move their business from where they are to low carbon. And there's about 10,000 members on 2 Degrees now. It's just got second round funding to launch in the US, so that'll probably double in the next few months. And there are specific networks. What's different around this as a network is that the networks are not accidental. They're very managed and focused around particular issues. And there is a network around smart cities, which is sponsored by Cisco. So I suggest that there's somebody that, Steve, we need to go and talk to. But I know that that's happening already, so that's okay. But there's one of the things that's great about the network is that they run webinars. It's very easy to hold something like this online. You can do it in a lunch hour, or you can do it, in an afternoon, an hour at a time. You can log in online, and the presentation can be there online. That means that it's very easy to get involved in particular issues, get access to information, get contacts that you wouldn't normally be able to access, and to go to a whole day, take a day to go, for example, to learn about carbon reduction commitment is a big thing. But if you can go online for an hour, learn something useful, not only that, learn who to talk to next, and what you need to do next, and then maybe 2 months later, come back when you've done some work implementing your CRC responsibilities in your organisation, and then learn some more. That's a very, very effective way of learning. And there are also, I would have been on the new Green Finance Instruments for Cities seminar this afternoon, but I'm here instead. And there are some other interesting sessions going on in future months. But I think it's an area that we can think about how we can interact with decision makers, and if you like, expand the reach of the programme into the commercial world. We've paralleled that. We've taken the same software platform from 2 Degrees, taken out all the content because it's all designed for a business audience, changed the business model and relaunched it for communities. So it's a communities to communities network now. It's very new. It's not the only community to communities network, obviously, because there are transition towns and low carbon communities network and so on. But they're a little bit hair-shirt, and a lot of people, if you like, the mainstream of society don't take the innovators as their model for what they do themselves. And so we think there's a great opportunity for a network which is like 2 Degrees but aimed at communities to have an impact. So those are the 5 markets, the 5, if you like, case studies that I'm looking at, and I'm looking now at what can be drawn as conclusions from comparing and contrasting and looking at those markets. And really the main, if you like, the common threads out of these 5 case studies are really around what causes them. Is there a requirement or is there the money? And how do they happen? Who takes responsibility for delivering? So if you take information as an enabler, the smart meters case study, the market quite clearly needs creating, and the way that that's happening is through an obligation on the energy suppliers to install those meters. That's not to say that they will do all the work. It may be that the communications company actually do the delivery, but there has to be a market created and there has to be an obligation to do that market. Because whilst it's in everybody's interests for smart meters to happen, there are a lot of issues about getting that market to happen that if it was left to the market itself, it would either not happen or would happen chaotically. Things like common communication protocols so that people can switch suppliers or switch meters and it will still work. So that's why the obligation is so important and why the protocols need to be developed, if you like, at a policy level. The commercial leasehold concept, what made it happen? Well, it was kind of there already, but the feed-in tariffs hasn't half given it a kick at the backside as a market that's developing. What needs to happen in organisational terms? Well, that leasehold relationship is changing quite a lot, and that's something that elsewhere I've written about, so I won't go into detail here. The new Green Deal, the common element there is, again, how is it going to be financed? Who's causing it? And that's legislation. The organisational relationship issues to deliver, it is a complicated offer to go and refurbish the 26 million homes that we have. There is not one organisation that can do that, and that will require new partnerships to deliver that. Public sector decisions, schools and so on. Well, the finance there was, the delivery rather, was through private providers, but it was a requirement of their contracts in the PFI process, and there was additional money on the table to do that. So there was finance there. It was about 110 million to do schools. And the organisational relationship issues, there was a contract in place that says what has to be achieved and what the consequences of not achieving that target are. And the penalties are quite severe. In the community space, it is going to take new mechanisms to finance it, and some of those have been demonstrated locally through industrial and provincial societies and through shareholder offerings and so on. But it didn't happen on its own. It took quite a lot of government support to get that to happen, at least in the first instance. And if it doesn't take government support, it's going to take bank support. So there again, there's a new structure and new finance routes. And new business startups. Well, actually, to be honest, it was very hard to fill these boxes when I was writing this presentation, because there ain't nothing other than Carbon Trust support. And Carbon Trust are obsessed with technology. They will only support, the first question if you want to go to Carbon Trust to start up a business, they say, what's your IP? What's your intellectual property? What can you protect? If it's just a new service delivery model, they are not interested. So that is an area where actually I think there's a great gap and a great need, actually. So as I say, I've done a lot of work in putting the evidence together, but the theoretical work is to do some explaining and so on about what's happening in here, what could happen better based on the theoretical literature is still very much in progress. I've talked about an evolutionary approach to technical change, and that's one that I'm very keen on. But one thing we need to understand from the case studies is that each of these markets is very different. The pre-existing relationships in those markets, if you like, between landlord and tenant, or between local authority and schools, is very different. And so what works in each of those pre-existing relationships is very different. And if you like, each market is an ecosystem, which is why my unit of study is a market, rather than something smaller and more manageable like a company. An actor network theory, I think, and particularly a relatively new development in that situational analysis, understanding how people relate to each other and how organisations relate to each other, is something that I think will help shed light on some of the relationships and some of the markets that I'm observing. Finally, the policy conclusions. I think this pretty much is the final slide. The change from evolutionary policy, where costs and benefits are known, to transformational policy, which is target-based without any visible means of delivery at the present time, is a very challenging one. And I think it will cause, and has caused, quite disruptive change. I would also argue that in terms of innovation policy, that it, as I say, with regard to Carbon Trust, it's very technology focused. But the solutions that we need, as I said in one of the very early slides, we have available to us and we understand. What we need to understand is how we get very, very large take-up of technologies we know about. And that really is service innovation. There is no support for service innovation in the UK. And that's something that we need to focus on. I think actually also a conclusion, and this is perhaps not so much from this work, but from previous work, big firms like British Gas and so on, I'm not singling out British Gas, sorry, energy suppliers, if you like, are risk averse. And actually future service models may lie in businesses or partnerships which don't exist, or at least don't necessarily exist in this space. So they might be large infrastructure providers, but not necessarily low carbon infrastructure providers. And that actually is a very difficult issue for policy. Policy over the last 15 years has been very consultative. How the hell do you consult with somebody who doesn't exist or doesn't exist in that market? So that's a problem for government. I recognise it's a problem for government, but the problem is that government doesn't recognise it's a problem for government, and that needs to change. And the final question really is, what works? And this is something that I want to go through with each of the case studies. What works by work, I mean emissions reductions, what makes energy more secure as well as low carbon, what is the cost, and importantly, what's the cost to whom, how easily can they be scaled, how many communities could do what West Oxford has done with low carbon West Oxford, and how quickly could it work. And those are some of the references. I've just put them in there for completeness. I won't go through them now, but they're for you to browse through afterwards. And that's where I'm up to.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark. Thank you.